Hello and happy holidays. It's December 27th here in Singapore, and this is Mike Davie with this week's data space analysis. It is that time of the year, between Christmas and New Year's, where everybody likes to reflect on what has gone on in the last year. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of top 10 lists, years in review, what's going to happen in 2019. So I've been spending my time reading some of these and just getting caught up on last year's trends. And so with this article, it goes through the past life, or the life of the first ever JP Morgan chief data officer, and gives Peter's background, how he got into it, and sort of now he's at Scotiabank, and sort of the steps as have evolved since 2006. So it's quite interesting what has gone on, what the responsibilities of a chief data officer have been, and how those are changing. And so when people think of data in a company, there's actually a lot of different aspects that you have to look at. You can first look at just the technology. So the person who had this role could just be a tech person. It might have been that in the past somebody just understood technology, big data technologies, and how to actually merge systems. So it could have been a completely technical role back in 2006. But then you see it start merging, and we've seen this here as companies go through stages. Okay, it's one thing to be able to collect the data, or at least know the technology to collect the data. And then the next thing is basically data engineering side. Is actually how can you actually process this data and get it into the systems that it needs to get into. So you look at from a technology to a data engineering standpoint. And then from there, the company has to look at, oh, wait a second, how do we make sense of this? And then from there, you go into more like an analytics or business intelligence type personality, someone who understands how to derive insights from data. And as the world evolves, technology evolves, education evolves, we start seeing the emergence of data science, and then you have mathematicians. And so somebody who's in this role also needs to understand that aspect. And then as you go into machine learning, artificial intelligence, you can see the chief data officer's role evolving. And it just doesn't come from the technology, but now you have everybody, you have to understand the technology, the engineering, the data science, as well as now you're going to machine learning, algorithms, AI. And then there's another part in there too, is compliance, regulation. So in Singapore here, that chief data officers also in charge of privacy. By law now, every single company must have somebody who's in charge of PDPA, the Personal Data Protection Act, ensuring the company is abiding by the law here on how they collect and process data. And so we see over the years, a chief data officer it could be 4.0 or even 7.0, depending on the company and how they've evolved. But what we do see is the importance of a chief data officer, chief information officer, chief data and analytics officer, whatever you want to call it, or how many you need, that we do see data become a pivotal role in most organizations. The interesting here, they also talk about Amazon and Google. And when you actually look at companies who are completely data-driven companies, that there is no one chief data officer. It's almost like every division and every function requires this type of role, or the role of each one of those skill sets. And so it's quite interesting we see 2018, 2019. There's no one trend. You can't say that okay, now everybody's got a chief data officer, or somebody's got a chief data compliance officer. But what we're going to see is just that companies are going to be embracing more and more of these functions, either from the top in the executive roles, or have them spread out and shared between different functions and organizations. And there's one quote here that I found quite interesting. Let me just scroll here and see if I can find it quickly here. So there's two quotes here that actually I found quite interesting, so I thought I'd share them here. So Peter Saranita, the first ever chief data officer at JP Morgan, supposedly in the world, stated that we have gone from the Stone Age to space travel in the course of a decade. And so actually it's quite interesting they mentions that, because what we're seeing, we see that as well, that in a couple of years you're seeing companies advance very quickly from having zero data dependency to completely running their organizations via data. The power that data brings to decision making is unbelievable. So we are seeing very fast iterations on how and what people are doing. Another point that they also mention is that one of the trends that they're seeing for coming up this year, and that is that the company's focusing on two aspects when it comes to the Chief Data Officer 4.0, and that's characterized by one is using data as a source of innovation. So what we see that companies now are using it to basically improve their organization, find how to actually innovate and build better either product lines or solve issues within the organization. And lastly, and secondly, is for the purpose of business monetization. We see this ourselves. We've been in this data monetization space since 2014, and what we see is that companies realize that actually these data assets can not only solve their own problems, but can solve problems for the clients. And by providing data, either services or the raw data itself, that they're actually monetizing these. And so, that's the first article that sort of just talks about, the chief data officer and how roles in organizations are being shaped by data. Secondly here, this is a good survey. So this is from eMarketer.com, and they're talking about 5 charts explaining the state of third-party data. So when you look at so how are people using data that's not their own, that they're actually acquiring from third-party sources? So it's a great survey here that I'll just highlight a few of the points here. First thing is they're talking about is data risky? Using third-party data is risky for marketers. We see a lot of things going on over the last year, making front-page news around privacy and GDPR. And so is this risky? What is it risky for organizations, and what are they, and how do they view their usage of third-party data? The first thing I highlight that even that we along with what was just mentioned in the first article, is that we see companies becoming more data dependent. And so what do you do when you don't have data? You have to acquire it. You have to get it from a third party. And so that we did see here that it was the growth in 2018 was a 17.5% increase. It's already a $19.2 billion industry of companies acquiring third-party data. And so when we look at it, what do they see as the major hindrances? What are some of the points that they see as what they're trying to improve on next year? Number one is always protecting customer data. Security is always a very important thing there. And then what we see as we come into the third point, we have can't trust data. Don't have easy access to data. Not enough third-party data. Is that companies realize the power of actually getting data that's not their own. So what happens when you're trying to understand your environment? It's very easy to understand your own company and your own ecosystem, your own company's ecosystem, your internal ecosystem, because you can collect that data. If you have a good chief data officer who puts in the IT and the systems to collect, you'll be able to access the data that your company needs for your own internal processing. But when you look at, now I want to understand my environment, I want to understand what my competitors do, I want to understand how my customers, be it either the consumer or enterprise, what is their environment that they operate? And companies realize that they require third-party data to do that. But how do you get this data? How do you trust this data? These are actually issues that we see faced in our own line of work, and in this survey here, we see that 1 out of 5 people don't get enough third-party data, that they can't find enough of it. And so what we're seeing is that people are looking for third-party data sources. They don't have enough data, but how do you map this together? How do you ensure that you trust all this data? How do you ensure you're compliant? Is some of the top issues that we see from the respondents of the survey. Next thing is that when you look at the data sources, who do people trust, and who are you dependent on? And so they asked this, which is actually quite interesting. I didn't realize myself that it'd be this high. That 42% of the respondents here are looking at third-party data as their information source. And so you can see companies are really reliant on external data, and I actually personally see that even growing for the future, is because when you start collecting third-party data, you're not going to get it from a Google or an Amazon, Facebook, that these companies are collecting vast information for their own usages. So how do you compete against that? How do you actually, as an organization, get enough data to make the same decisions Google can do with all their internal data, which is going to be very difficult. And so companies are going to be faced, as they become more and more, as they understand more and more the power of third-party data, they're going to start coming up with the other complications that we see in the surveys, like how do you always trust the data? How do you ensure that data is compliant? And do you have easy access to this data? So it's a great survey here. Actually, sorry, the last point there is that how do you integrate that data in? How do you get access to these data feeds? And we see, and the last thing, the barriers of entry for improving return on investment is actually being able to integrate these data into their system. How do you get third-party data, map it into your own system? Then 40% of respondents spoke about that, about how do you make sure that everything fits in. So what I'll do is I'll link these two articles, the Forbes article and the e-marketing article. That'll give you an idea of the chief data officer role, how that sort of evolved, and how organizations evolved. So if you're a company that's trying to understand, okay, who do we need to fill these roles and to ensure that we have a holistic view of data, definitely check that article out. And then the e-marketer, to try to understand how people view third-party data and how they're going to access third-party data. Check that out in the description below. Please leave a comment if there's topics that you'd like me to cover or discuss. Be happy to look into it. Just put in the comments, add a link to any articles. Until next week, thank you very much.